Bob Cenci, Jerry's Kids. It was the Dead Kennedys. I think it was 1980. I was still in high school, and I was into different kinds of music and punk or alternative or whatever you want to call it. And we went to see the Dead Kennedys, and I thought I was going to get smothered. It was so crowded. And this is before I think they like advertised slam dancing on. I remember seeing slam dancing like talked about in Rolling Stone. This was before that, and I thought I was going to be smothered. It was the most sickest show I've ever seen, and that's vivid in my mind. There was some idiots in the middle of the pit. Well, there was one idiot in the middle of the pit that was like, he was obviously a boxer, and so he didn't understand what was going on, but he was like punching people in the face. I remember when slam dancing first started, and kids would be knocking each other around. It was kind of like fun, but when I first saw SST Control, that was probably the most painful type of dance that I've experienced, and intimidating too, because all of a sudden there was like these skinheads. We were just into like Black Flag sounding type bands, and then all of a sudden there's like skinheads, and I was quite frankly intimidated. Discharge. I think, I don't know if people out there want to know what influenced Jerry's Kids, but my interpretation is we were heavily influenced by LA punk and also English punk. And my interpretation of what Jerry's Kids sound is, it's LA meets Discharge. And that's a band that I wish I saw. Actually, I saw them looking for a show in Kenmore Square at the Pizza Pad. And they had a bad rap, so they couldn't get a show. Steve Olson catching air on a half pipe. That's a tough one. I think Black Flag. I'm a big fan of the early singers, but when I saw them with Henry, I didn't see them with anyone else except for Dez. But when I saw them with Henry, I thought that was the best punk band I've seen. Well, the best punk band, though they evolved, but that moment in time, probably 1982, was Bad Brains. Hopped into Al Barill's van with a bunch of kids. We drove down to New York, and we saw the Bad Brains live. And one vivid moment is, the music was speeding up. And in that moment, HR did a backflip, landed on his feet, and landed right when the drum went. Jake Phelps. Oh, well, I know this is all about hardcore and stuff, but the best punk singer is obviously James Osterberg. I'm the biggest fan of Iggy Pop. Dwayne Peters' board that I broke. I forget how I broke it, but it's split in half. Well, with Jerry's Kids, obviously, probably from. It's really a tough question because, Jerry's Kids went through an evolution. We sounded like this, then we evolved into this, and then we moved on to that. But I think the most memorable show is probably our final show. And that was in December of '84 at the Paradise. And I remember kids wanted to slam dance, kids wanted to jump off the stage, and the bouncers were still assholes at that time. which was kind of odd, but they were still assholes at the time. And I remember the bouncer grabbing my guitar. All of a sudden, the sound of my guitar stopped, and I said, "Nobody touches my guitar." I said that like that, and all these kids just jumped on the bouncer and were like beating him. I'm like, whoa! And also at that show, we played "How Much Art," and Springer sang it. So that was a memorable show. That was like, Jerry's Kids is done. It's 1984. Going our separate ways. That's the most memorable show. Message to the youth. Oh, if you have an interest in music, that's great. Music is boundless. You don't have to stick into one little genre of music. You don't have to try to sound like this band to be cool. You can do whatever the fuck you want. Music is like pure freedom of expression. And that's the way I think everyone should think about their instrument. And music is very influential, and there are lots of influences. I didn't start off playing punk rock. I listened to a lot of jazz. I listened to a lot of rock and roll. And, I'm caught in this moment of, this is rebellious. See, this is the time. This is rebellious. And that's when things kind of go boom like that. And that's what hardcore was in the early 80s. Things just kind of connected at that moment, and I was there at that moment in Boston. So I wouldn't have an expectation. I would just enjoy the sound of cranking your guitar and playing it loud. That is a really good question, because it's kind of funny. I remember there was a club in Boston which later became Jumperjack Flash, but at the time it was called McNasty's, and Gangrene was opening for the Bad Brains. And so I had this shitty guitar that I gave Chris Doherty, and he actually played that shitty guitar and threw it up in the air and let it smash at that show. So that sticks in my mind. And then I remember being outside after the show, and people were like, "So Bob, what do you think about all this hardcore stuff? What do you think it is?" And I said to myself, "What do I think it is? I think it's just rock and roll. It's about being rebellious and playing music." And they were like, "Okay, Rock and Bob." The Rathskeller in Kenmore Square. Hardly. It's about creating, having fun, reinventing, reworking. So, what made Jerry's Kids play fast? Well, there were bands that were playing fast, like the Bad Brains that we saw that influenced us. Basically, we're just a bunch of dudes playing music that we like. We were covering the Ramones. We were playing Black Flag covers at the time, and I thought we sounded pretty good, and we're pretty close to Gangrene because they were from the same town. And so I remember Chris Doherty calling me up. He's like, "Bob, I want you to hear this new song I wrote." And because we would do that, we would trade songs over the phone. He was in his band, I was in my band, and we would trade like, "Oh, look what I came up with," over the phone. So all of a sudden he starts playing Snob at full speed. I'm just like, "Oh, wow, that's different." He's like, "We're gonna play as fast as possible." I'm like, "Oh, really? Wow, that's cool." And so then they started doing that, and they were getting all this attention, and I was like, so I devised this little plan to blow off Gangrene, meaning we're gonna be better than Gangrene. We actually have recordings before "Is This My World" that sound kind of like it was written for this is Boston, not LA, but it has that like power and force that you hear on Is This My World, and that's where we started playing faster, and things got faster, and we Brian Jones had to leave the band because he was having a tough time. He was young, so it was tough for him to get out of the house, and so Rick went on to continue to play bass, and he sang. And Rick was like this songwriting machine. He would have a new riff, new song every rehearsal, and I was kind of frustrated, like, oh well, what about my stuff? And then so I just kind of built off of what he presented, so I would add stuff to what he wrote, and that's basically what you hear on Is This My World. Yeah, we played the East Coast. We'd play New York, we played DC, we played Philly. Really good scene in Philly. Was there a kind of brotherhood? I think so, because we're all kind of playing the same genre of music, but we didn't like fit it. We didn't have mohawks or anything. We didn't fit in like the way we looked as far as everyone else. I remember distinctly, I think it was just dancing in New York, like seeing the Bad Brains or like a CBGB show. You know, the guys from New York are obviously punk rock. They got these big mohawks. They got they're decked out, spikes, whatever. And the guys from Boston were just like dressed like I am right now. Though I am wearing a sweater, which is kind of like, I'm an old man. But so we just kind of dressed normally to kind of blend in, where the New York guys kind of stood out. And I remember someone commenting from New York, like, you don't know who these Boston guys are. In the pit, you don't know what they're going to do. Yeah, for me, for the time that I started playing in the music, and then, it's supposed to be, when I started getting into that type of music, it was all about no values. And then all of a sudden there was values. There was like straight edge and stuff. And at the time I didn't understand what straight edge was. And I was like, I just became of age. I'm not going to stop drinking. So I really wasn't into the straight edge thing, but I kind of respected it. So I just kind of stood on the sidelines as far as that went. And I don't know. For me, it's all about expression and being creative, where the straight edge thing was like this unite, where this force of kids unite with this force of kids, and yeah, that has a value too, because there was tons of kids at the time that were just like lost and confused, and they needed some guidance, and that was something for them to grasp onto. Actually, that name came from the 70s, when I was at a friend's house, and he had a CB radio, and we were on the CB radio just being silly and saying stuff, and people had all these crazy handles, and there was this guy named Gangrene. So that stuck in my head. And then a few years later, we're playing punk and stuff, and Jerry's Kids formed. Me and Rick had a band. The drummer left, and we signed up with Rick's younger brother, who had a band, and we didn't really have a name. I'm like, I want to call it Gangrene, and they were like, we're gonna call it Jerry's Kids, and they thought that was the funniest name because of Jerry Lewis or whatever. And as soon as we decided on that name, Gangrene, as soon as we decided on that name, Jerry's Kids, Chris Doherty was like, "Are you gonna use that name?" I'm like, "No, I guess not. We're not using it." He's like, "Can we use it?" I'm like, "Sure, you can use it." That moment, it was spray painted everywhere.